Picture this. You're standing in the shadow of the Taj Mahal at dawn. The white marble seems to breathe, catching the first golden light. Before you marvel at its perfect symmetry, before you whisper about eternal love, listen. Listen for an echo that has bounced off these walls for 4 centuries. The scream of a woman. On June 17th, 1631, in a sweltering tent hundreds of miles from here, Mumtaz Mahal, the chosen one of the palace, pressed her palms against blood-soaked linens and begged for death. After 30 hours of agonizing labor delivering her 14th child, her body gave out. The monument before you is not just a testament to love, it is a gravestone for motherhood itself. This is the hidden world of royal reproduction, where queens were not crowned for their wisdom, but bred for their wombs, where every pregnancy was a political gamble, and every stillborn child represented not just a personal grief, but a potential civil war. These are the stories of women whose bodies became battlegrounds for dynasty, whose suffering was measured not in tears, but in heirs. Take Queen Anne of England. She ascended the throne in 1702, but her crown was built on a foundation of 17 broken dreams. 17 times, her body had swelled with hope for the Stuart dynasty. 17 times, that hope had been crushed. Stillbirths, miscarriages, and children who lived just long enough to be named before their tiny coffins were carried to the cold stone vaults of Westminster Abbey. The cruelty of Anne's story isn't just medical, it's political. Every miscarriage was documented by court officials, every stillbirth examined by physicians seeking to assign blame, as if her body had willfully betrayed the nation. It began with a stillborn daughter in 1684, setting a tragic pattern that would stalk her for the rest of her life. When her longest surviving child, William, Duke of Gloucester, died at the age of 11, it wasn't just a mother burying her son. It was a dynasty breathing its last. In the vault where Anne now rests, she is surrounded by the ghosts of her children. William, the infants George and Anne Sophia, 2 daughters named Mary, and at least a dozen other stillborns. A queen's tomb turned into a silent nursery of sorrow. What we know for certain is that each pregnancy became a public spectacle, and each loss a national crisis. The queen's womb was not her own. It belonged to England, and England kept demanding a debt her body simply could not pay. In the opulent courts of the Mughal Empire, being the beloved of an emperor was its own kind of curse. Mumtaz Mahal died from a postpartum hemorrhage, a preventable ailment, after giving birth to her 14th child. She had been pregnant for nearly every year of her 19-year marriage to Shah Jahan. Think about that for a moment. 19 years, 14 pregnancies, only 7 surviving children. Her body never had a season of rest. She traveled with the emperor on his military campaigns, heavy with child, jostled in carriages across rough terrain, because an emperor's favorite could never be left behind. She died because medicine, in 1631, could not save a woman bleeding out after 30 hours of labor. The Taj Mahal, that perfect, shimmering jewel, rises from the banks of the Yamuna River, not just as a monument to love, but as a testament to the cost of being treasured, not as a person, but as a producer of heirs. If anyone elevated royal motherhood to an imperial strategy, it was Maria Theresa of Austria. In a rare royal love match, she bore 16 children in 18 years, a pregnancy roughly every 13 months for nearly 2 decades, all while running one of Europe's largest empires. There was no maternity leave for an empress. She negotiated treaties between contractions, planned military campaigns while nursing infants, and managed the marriages of her elder children while giving birth to their younger siblings. But this maternal success was a double-edged sword. She used her children as pawns in dynastic games, sacrificing their happiness for political advantage. Her most famous daughter, Maria Antonia, would become Marie Antoinette and lose her head to the guillotine. Another daughter, Maria Elizabeth, was considered a great beauty until smallpox scarred her face, destroying her value on the royal marriage market. Even 16 children couldn't guarantee a dynasty's simple survival, and her body, the engine of the empire, paid the price for its relentless productivity. Perhaps no story better illustrates the psychological toll of this pressure than that of Catherine de' Medici. For 10 agonizing years after her marriage to the future Henry II of France, Catherine's womb remained empty. 10 years of monthly disappointments, of physicians prodding and examining her, of court whispers about divorce growing louder with each passing season. The pressure led her to consult doctors who advised her to try every humiliating trick in the book, including applying cow dung mixed with ground stag antlers to her body and drinking mule's urine. Imagine a queen of France, so desperate to prove her worth that she would endure such rituals, all because her value as a human was measured solely by her ability to conceive. All the while, her husband openly flaunted his relationship with his mistress, Diane de Poitiers, a woman nearly 20 years older but infinitely more powerful. When Catherine finally gave birth to her first child in 1544, the relief was so overwhelming that courtiers wept. She would go on to have 10 children, but those first 10 barren years had permanently scarred her. They forged a cold, calculating survivor, a woman who had learned the brutal lesson that in the world of royalty, a woman's power began and ended with her ability to produce an heir. The queen's body was a vessel, not just for a child, but for the future of a nation. Her success or failure was etched into the history books, but the personal cost was written on her own flesh and soul. This brutal transaction of womb for crown played out across centuries, with each queen facing her own unique version of the same ironclad contract. One of the most remarkable of these reproductive careers belonged to Eleanor of Aquitaine, a woman who bore children for 2 different royal houses across 3 turbulent decades. In her first marriage to Louis VII of France, she produced 2 daughters, a failure in a kingdom that demanded a male heir. This lack of a son was a key reason their marriage was annulled. But Eleanor, a formidable political player in her own right, wasted no time. Just 2 months later, she married Henry Plantagenet, the future Henry II of England. For him, her body proved more compliant. She bore 5 sons and 3 daughters, founding the very dynasty that would rule England for centuries. Her sons included the legendary Richard the Lionheart and the infamous King John. She had fulfilled her queenly duty spectacularly, providing not just one heir, but a host of spares. Yet this success offered no protection. As her sons grew into ambitious men, they became pawns in the power struggle against their own father. In 1173, when they revolted against Henry, Eleanor supported them. For this betrayal, she was captured and spent the next 16 years imprisoned by the very husband for whom she had built a dynasty. She had learned the hardest lesson of all. Even the most successful royal mother could be discarded once her reproductive value had ended and her children had become weapons. Centuries later, one might assume the burden had eased. But for Queen Victoria, the pressures of royal reproduction felt just as suffocating. Even in a supposedly more enlightened age, she famously declared she had the greatest horror of having children and would rather have none. Yet, over 17 years, she gave birth to 9. Victoria loathed pregnancy, describing it in private letters as feeling like a dog or a cow. She suffered from what we would now recognize as postpartum depression, a struggle made worse by the fact that each pregnancy took her away from her duties as monarch. Between 1840 and 1844, she had only 17 pregnancy-free months in which to rule. In her absence, her husband, Prince Albert, essentially served as regent. While she despised the process, she and Albert embraced the product. Their 9 children were strategically married into royal families across the continent, earning Victoria the nickname, the Grandmother of Europe. They believed these dynastic ties would secure peace. Instead, They created a web of familial rivalries that would explode into the First World War. And through her bloodline, Victoria passed on more than just crowns. She passed on the hemophilia gene, a hidden genetic curse that brought suffering and early death to the royal houses of Spain, Germany, and most famously, to the son of the last Russian Tsar. Her body had secured the British succession, but it had also, unknowingly, seeded tragedy across a continent. While some queens were prisoners of their wombs, others found a strange, difficult power through them. Blanche of Castile demonstrated that motherhood could be a path to political authority, but only at an enormous personal cost. Her marriage to Louis VIII of France was happy and fruitful, producing 12 or 13 children. But upon his death from dysentery in 1226, Blanche was left in a critical position. She was a 38-year-old widow, a regent for her 12-year-old son, the future St. Louis IX. 6 of her children were already dead. With the kingdom vulnerable to rebellious nobles who smelled opportunity in a child king, Blanche had to act. Within a month, she had her son crowned and brutally forced the reluctant barons to swear their allegiance. She was a grieving mother who had no time for grief. She had to fight wars, negotiate treaties, and manage a kingdom, all while protecting her surviving children. When confronted with the armies of rebellious barons, instead of fighting, she negotiated. Her authority rooted not in military might, but in her fierce protection of her son's legacy. But the psychological toll was immense. Blanche suffered from a heart ailment, yet continued to preside over all court responsibilities. In 1252, she suffered a fatal heart attack, dying in service to the crown her son wore, a crown she had preserved with the last of her strength. Her legacy wasn't just the children she bore, but the kingdom she saved, proving that the role of royal mother could be transformed from one of passive vessel to one of active, ruthless power. The cycle was relentless, a human assembly line for heirs. Queen Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, who married King George III of England in 1761, fulfilled her royal duty with ruthless efficiency. Over 21 years, she gave birth to 15 children. For 2 decades, Charlotte was almost constantly pregnant or recovering from childbirth. Contemporary accounts describe her as increasingly worn down, her health failing under the sheer physical strain. She had provided the Hanoverian line with a multitude of sons, securing the succession, yet her children's lives were not their own. They were raised, as one observer noted, like birds in a cage, their futures dictated by political necessity from the moment they were born. Sometimes, the most tragic stories are the shortest. Isabella of Valois became Queen of England at age 6. Her brief adult life was a frantic race against time. Married to Charles of Orléans at 17, she immediately began the expected cycle. Her first pregnancy ended in a stillbirth. Her second produced a daughter who died in infancy. Her third pregnancy, in 1409, killed both mother and child. Isabella died just shy of her 20th birthday, a life consumed and extinguished by the very duty she was born to fulfill. Then there was Constance of Castile, Louis VII of France's second wife, brought in specifically because his first, Eleanor of Aquitaine, had failed to produce a son. The pressure on her was immense. In just 6 years of marriage, she bore multiple children but died around 1160, likely from the complications of her last delivery, without ever providing the desperately needed male heir. Her life was a short, sharp testament to the fact that a queen's value was measured entirely by the gender of the child she produced. When you add up the numbers, the scale of sacrifice is staggering. These women endured at least 127 documented pregnancies between them. But these numbers tell only part of the story. The most degrading aspect of royal pregnancy was its utterly public nature. The birth of a royal baby was a state event that required witnesses to ensure no substitute infant was smuggled in. Queens often labored before great audiences of courtiers. When Marie Antoinette gave birth in 1778, the press of people, the heat, and the sealed windows in her chamber were so overwhelming that after a 12-hour labor, she fainted from lack of oxygen. Imagine that moment. You have just endured hours of agony, and your first thought cannot be for your child's health, but for the political ramifications of their gender. Courtiers in the inner room would signal the baby's sex to those waiting outside by hurling their hats in the air for a boy, or crossing their arms for a girl. The Queen's cries echoed not just through palace corridors, but through the halls of international diplomacy. What is most striking is the emotional isolation. These queens could not rebel against the endless cycle of pregnancy and loss. To complain was to question their primary, perhaps only, value to the crown. Catherine de' Medici developed a reputation for being cold and calculating, but perhaps that was the only way to survive watching half your children die after a decade of humiliating fertility treatments. You learn to treat your children as political assets, because the alternative is madness. The great irony is that for all the suffering, for all the children sacrificed on the altar of dynasty, most of these royal lines eventually died out. The Stuart dynasty ended with Anne, despite her 17 pregnancies. The Valois line ended with Catherine de' Medici's sons, despite her 10 children. All that pain, all that loss, and in the end, history simply moved on. The monuments they left behind, the reforms of Maria Theresa, the Protestant settlement under Queen Anne, survived not because of their children, but because of their own actions. Perhaps that is the most tragic lesson of all. These queens had value far beyond their wombs, but they lived in a time that could not see past the immediate need for an heir. The next time you see a monument to royal power, pause. In Westminster Abbey, tourists walk past Queen Anne's tomb, but underneath their feet lie the tiny coffins of 17 deferred dreams. In Agra, millions visit the Taj Mahal, but few know it was built on the grave of a woman who died because her body could no longer keep up with an emperor's demands. These women deserved better medicine, better choices, and better recognition of their humanity. They deserved to be remembered not just as mothers of dynasties, but as individuals who endured unimaginable pressure with remarkable strength. The hidden cost of royal bloodlines was paid not in gold or territory, but in the bodies and souls of the women who bore the weight of dynasties on their backs. Their stories remind us that history's greatest monuments are often built on foundations of forgotten sacrifice, and that the most invisible suffering is sometimes the most profound.